Okay, we'll just take turns. Good.
Amen. Lenny, are we recording? We're good? All right. Well, welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Good evening. Thank you for having us tonight. We're really excited to be here. We actually gave this training to your staff about a year ago. So we were really honored to be invited back to give this training to you all. So thank you for having us. My name is Catherine Min. I'm the Santee Watershed Coordinator for the South Carolina Office of Resilience. And that's why I'm here speaking to you tonight with my colleague Adelaide.
Hi, y'all. I'm Adelaide Bates. I'm the Climate Resilience Manager at Furman University. I work at the Shy Institute specifically, but I work with local governments to help. I'm a dedicated support person to help with resilience. I'm excited to join Catherine tonight.
And I'm not seeing that the clicker is working. Brief pause. We'll pause. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. So for the next hour together, we would like to start off by discussing and defining the concept of resilience, just to kind of level set and make sure we're all on the same page, since resilience means a lot of different things to different people. I'll introduce my office, the South Carolina Office of Resilience, since we are a newer state agency, and then share some of the resources that we can offer Somerville. We'll share examples of local resilience building activities that are happening in neighboring jurisdictions that y'all might consider to build on the great work that you're already doing. And along the way, Adelaide and I will connect you with resources to help you build resilience. So I'm really excited for our next hour together. And we will pass around a sign-in sheet just to make sure that we have credit. We get y'all credit for this. So before we start, I'd love to ask you all and people in the room, what do you think of when you think of resilience?
Be brave, just shout it out.
The ability to bounce back.
Love it. We have a second. Ditto. Any other words? Ooh, withstand. Okay. All right. Well, that is a good answer. That's what a lot of people say when we ask that question. And that certainly is part of resilience. And at the Office of Resilience, when we were creating our statewide plan in 2023, we had to start by defining what resilience means, in this context. So with the help of academics, practitioners, other folks, we landed on this definition, which is that resilience is the ability of communities, economies, and ecosystems to anticipate, absorb, recover, and thrive when presented with environmental change and natural hazards. So of course, this is a pretty broad definition. It includes a lot of different activities and programs and policies to help us become more resilient. So to start off,
Sorry, we're not used to sharing a mic. So when we're thinking about resilience, it's really important to think about what we're building resilience to. There are two types of hazards that we'd like you all to consider today as we talk about this. And those are shocks and stressors. So a shock is going to be a sudden event that impacts a community or a system with rapid onset, something that happens immediately with immediate impacts. Whereas a stressor is going to be a more long-term trend that impacts a community or a system over time. So something that happens every day and impacts us over time. So an example of a shock could be something like a hurricane, a rain bomb like what we had this weekend and last weekend, a hazardous waste spill, or an earthquake. Whereas a stressor might be something like aging infrastructure or rapid population growth, sea level rise, or drought.
And sometimes when we're thinking about resilience, it can be helpful to characterize what makes a system less resilient and compare that to a more resilient system, to learn from both of those examples. So in this graph, you can see on the left, on the y-axis, we have our system function and our baseline system function. And then when we have a shock, like a natural hazard, we see a dramatic decline in system function that persists for a long time. And although we see that recovery does happen because of ongoing pressure from those stressors, like maybe aging infrastructure or long-term environmental change, we're never able to recover up to baseline. And we can see that a system is less resilient for a wide variety of reasons. Usually it's a lot of small factors that come together rather than just one, strong characteristic. But it could be because we have deferred maintenance, or we have weak building codes that allow us to develop in risky areas, or we're planning with the past in mind rather than with future conditions in mind. But in contrast, when we look at a more resilient system, again, we have our baseline system function on the left side of the graph. And when we have a shock like a natural hazard, of course, we do see a decline in system function. That makes sense because we had a disruption to our system, but it's much less severe and it persists for a much shorter amount of time. And although we still face those ongoing long-term stressors, we do see that increase in system function over time. And again, this is because of a lot of different factors coming together. Maybe we're coordinating at multiple levels and with multiple entities. We have funded in our maintenance. Our public has a strong understanding of risk so they can make risk-informed decisions. We're using high-quality data. All those things come together to make a more resilient system. And we see that this has a lot of co-benefits. Of course, we have economic vitality. We're not seeing as many disruptions for our businesses. We often have a protected environment and all of the co-benefits associated with that. And our public, they're empowered because they know the risks that they're facing. So some key points about resilience. When we're thinking about how to become more resilient, we need to consider both current conditions and anticipate future conditions. So we need to think to ourselves, how might shocks and stressors in Somerville change in the future? So just to name a few, we could think about population growth, we could think about land use change, we could think about environmental changes, but there are many others that impact, Somerville or the region or the state or the country that we could think about. So the central questions we have are, what will the future require and how can we prepare for it? So as many of you all mentioned, when we think about resilience, we often think about bouncing back, which certainly is part of resilience. If we return to this graph with our baseline system function and then our shock that occurs, we don't want to be on path A, where in our recovery effort, we never make it back to our baseline system function. Of course, we want to pursue path B, that's what we've always thought, and bounce back. But I do want to present an alternative, which would be path C, which is where we recover to a higher standard. So this is kind of abstract to think about, but one example is in our housing recovery program. We recovered this house after, I think, Hurricane Matthew or Hurricane Florence. And when we rebuilt it, we didn't just repair it to the same elevation, but we elevated it so that the same size flood event would not cause the catastrophic damage that occurred the first time. So we can apply this principle to all different types of infrastructure, other ways of thinking, but just thinking about repairing to a higher standard so the same size disruption doesn't cause issues in our system as it did the first time. So other key points about resilience is that building resilience is highly localized and it takes a really detailed understanding of local risks and vulnerabilities and, locally developed solutions. So you all definitely in this room are all experts on Somerville. I'm not definitely coming from Columbia saying like, this is what you should do to build resilience. But rather we're here to just present the general idea and then some strategies that you all can consider and kind of tailor to how it would fit best in Somerville and in this unique context. And just as a little teaser for what we're going to get into later in the presentation, when we think about building resilience, it's not just, like pipes and inlets, although that can be a very important part of it, but we do it through a wide variety of projects, programs, and policies. So if we think about building resilience, today we're talking about building resilience to flooding, but it can involve conservation or maybe voluntary housing buyouts, certainly infrastructure projects, but also building codes, land use regulations. All these different factors are all important as we think about building resilience to flooding.
Okay, she's thrown a lot at you in the first 5 minutes. So I want to take a minute to return to that original definition of resilience and ask you all how resilient you currently think Somerville to be. You guys might get an opt-out of this. We might. So we'll do a show of hands. Okay. Others? Be brave here too. Yeah, says so. That makes a lot of sense. And this is what we see when we ask this question to most rooms. There are many reasons for that, but there's also the key one, which is you can always be more resilient. It's a never ending process. There's always the opportunity to be more resilient. So we're excited to talk to you about some ideas today. Yes.
Right. Before we go any further, I did want to take a second to introduce the South Carolina Office of Resilience for those of you who may not be familiar with the office. We actually started in our first capacity in 2015 following the historic floods that many of you remember. And at that time, we were called the South Carolina Disaster Recovery Office because we managed the federal funds that came down for our housing recovery and rebuilding program. And what we found in 2015 was that our previous major disaster that hit our state actually was Hurricane Hugo in 1989. And in those intervening years, a lot of the institutional knowledge related to disaster recovery actually had been lost in our state from people retiring or moving out of state. So Governor Haley at the time created the South Carolina Disaster Recovery Office to manage the recovery efforts. And then, as you all remember, we were hit back to back with Hurricane Matthew in 2016 and Hurricane Florence in 2018. And the office persisted through those disasters to help manage the federal funding that came down. So in 2018, Governor McMaster said, hey, we've been hit by these 3 back-to-back disasters, and we've experienced significant loss of life and property in our state. What can we do to be a little bit more proactive instead of reactive and think about how we prepare our state? So he created the Floodwater Commission to study this issue, and they had several recommendations, one of which being the creation of the South Carolina Office of Resilience, which would absorb the South Carolina Disaster Recovery Office and then also do long-term resilience planning. And then another recommendation being to write the first statewide resilience plan. So our office opened in its current capacity in 2021 and then published the first statewide resilience plan in 2023. And in our office, everything we do falls into 3 main buckets. So we do our long-term disaster recovery, mitigation, and resilience planning. So for disaster recovery, as I've spoken about a little bit before, we do housing, repairing, and rebuilding for some of our most vulnerable homeowners in our state. So those are typically people who make less than 30% the area median income, and they have either someone who's elderly or a child or someone with a disability in the home. So we do that in FEMA-declared counties after major disasters. An important part of that program is our disaster case management program. We have these disaster case managers who assist disaster survivors with their unmet disaster-caused needs. So this is a really cool program where they will connect them with private, public, nonprofit resources wherever possible, related to maybe getting furniture or childcare or clothing or other, key essentials that were lost in the disaster. And this program has actually been so successful in helping citizens and also saving money related to the recovery process that other states are replicating South Carolina's program, which is exciting. Our second program bucket is mitigation. This also is funded through the federal government, through funds that come after disasters, but then also ARPA money. And this involves plans and studies to help jurisdictions get to the bottom of why they're having flooding issues. Infrastructure projects, typically big drainage and stormwater projects. A voluntary housing buyout program, which I'll speak about more in a couple minutes, and then a match grants program to help these jurisdictions access federal funds if they don't have the match. And then finally, we have our resilience planning section. That's where I work, and we're responsible now for the implementation of the statewide resilience and risk reduction plan, and also our watershed-based resilience planning process, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes. But I did want to note that at SCORE, we mostly work in the recovery and mitigation parts of the disaster cycle. We do work closely with South Carolina EMD, but they are responsible for the direct response. So at the state, we do, several levels of resilience planning, and I'll start by talking about what we do at the state level. And again, that is through our strategic statewide resilience and risk reduction plan, which I know is a mouthful. But when we were starting that plan, we looked at risks and vulnerabilities related to flooding from a variety of perspectives. So of course, we looked at South Carolina's soil types and land cover because that obviously, impacts how the water infiltrates the ground. But we also looked at how flooding will impact people. So we looked at, where populations currently are and how they're projected to move in our state. We looked at critical infrastructure like roadways or gas stations or hospitals to see how that is impacted by flood risk. And then we also looked at how flooding exposure aligned with social vulnerability so we could see who in our state would be most impacted. And all of these analyses and, input from experts around the state resulted in this statewide plan. And this identifies major flood risks and losses that could occur in our state if we have another disaster or extreme weather event. It is meant to guide state investment in flood mitigation. And then it also recommends resilience building strategies that local governments can consider implementing, with the key being that they always try to prioritize strategies that have multiple co-benefits beyond just flood mitigation for communities, economies, and ecosystems. So we could look at how these different strategies positively impact, tourism or recreation or habitat creation or water quality, all these many co-benefits. So that, ideally in our state, we would enjoy these flood mitigation strategies on a sunny day as much as we would on a rainy day. And since
Real quick about that picture, if you go back one, was it intentional to have the photo of the marsh at low tide?
I think so. I think they were trying to highlight the
The capacity?
yeah, the capacity in the mountains to the sea there, but I like that observation.
That'd be very helpful if all storms
Right.
came at low tide.
That's right. And since we published the plan, we've been implementing it in a few ways. I'll talk about most of these throughout the presentation, but through our watershed-based planning effort, that's why I'm here tonight. Through coordinating and providing data, which Somerville has access to, as a public entity in the state that I'm excited to share with you. And I have already shared some of that with staff here. And then through conserving land for flood mitigation, which y'all know is a big priority of Governor McMaster as well. So at the regional level, SCORE does resilience planning through our watershed-based resilience planning. And the purpose of this is to coordinate with communities across the watershed to identify risks and vulnerabilities, and then develop and prioritize solutions to build resilience to flooding, and then hopefully move those to implementation by leveraging, local, regional, state, and federal partnerships and technical assistance in grant opportunities. And just to level set for everyone in the room, a watershed is an area of land where all the water flows to a common point, whether that's a stream, a river, a lake, or the ocean. So like in a giant bathtub, everything goes to the drain. So at all times we're in a watershed, small watersheds make up large watersheds. And you can see the map. This is the planning basins that we use in the state. So I'm the Santee Watershed Coordinator, which is why I'm all today, since Somerville is located in the Santee. So the reason that we plan at the watershed level is because, as we like to say, water doesn't follow political boundaries. Like water doesn't just flow within a county or within Somerville limits. But what we do impacts our neighbors, and what our neighbors do impacts us. So this also was a recommendation from the Floodwater Commission report. And this really allows for the implementation of projects, programs, and policies that consider the impacts to the larger watershed. So for the next year and a half or so, we're working with communities to identify risks and vulnerabilities related to flooding, gather their proposed solutions, what they're doing now and for the next, 5 or so years, and then find what roadblocks they're seeing in implementing these solutions. And then we're trying to gather these up into watershed-wide reports so that all the other jurisdictions know, what their neighbors are also planning to do. And this will inform the 5-year update of our statewide resilience plan. And then this will inform, the needs that we present to the legislature to further resilience efforts in our state. So I also enlarged the map here. It's not that big, but so you can see the Santee watershed. So finally, at the local level, I kind of wanted to share some things that SCORE can provide to Somerville as you are doing your local resilience planning. The first being First Street Foundation flood data. So this is a nice complement to our FEMA flood maps, because we know that our FEMA flood maps are not always, up to date or complete or perfect depictions of risk. They certainly are not. So the First Street Foundation is a nationwide flood model that allows us to determine potential flood risk from rain, stream flow, sea level rise, tide, and storm surge at a 3 meters spatial resolution. So this is Somerville here in 2025 for a 100-year flood event. And I've also pulled 2055 because it gives projections for 30 years into the future. So if we toggle back and forth, you can see a couple areas that light up as being potentially, more flood prone in the future. So this data is really helpful because it can kind of help ground truth maybe what y'all are seeing in Somerville that is not reflected on FEMA flood maps. I don't know if y'all are familiar with the Columbia 5 Points area. That's where all the college bars are. It floods like every time it rains there, but that's not captured on our FEMA flood maps, but it is on the First Street Foundation flood model. So this is helpful data. It's available to all public entities in the state, and we want to make sure that Somerville has access to that. But for all of us who are not GIS analysts, you can access the First Street Foundation data and all of our other most used GIS layers through the Resilience Atlas. This is through, you can open it on your web browser on SCORE's website. So you can see I've overlaid some hazard data. So in this case, the FEMA flood maps with critical infrastructure. These are the fire departments. In another example, I've overlaid wetlands with your protected lands. So this is a helpful tool that, all of you can use to take a look at these data sets. And if you'd like a short tutorial, I'm happy to hop on a video call with anyone and walk you through how to use this tool. So finally, SCORE offers a little bit of guidance for how to integrate the resilience element into comprehensive plans. And we're actually partnering with Clemson University to get some more detailed guidance on this in the next few months. But basically, the central recommendation is that as we are thinking about building resilience, we need to integrate it into every part of the comprehensive planning process as much as possible. So while it's important to have, a standalone resilience element that looks at, probably now and future risk to our critical assets due to changing conditions and to our hazards, to our natural hazards, we want to make sure that that is also knit throughout in the other chapters. So when we're thinking about our natural resources or our priority investments, how are we also considering, current shocks and stressors and future shocks and stressors? So that's just a little tidbit to think about in that process.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Now that we've heard a little bit about what the state is up to, we're going to pivot and talk about what some of your neighbors are pursuing or considering in terms of building resilience, specifically to flooding in this section. And I'll let you.
And before we start off, we do want to acknowledge all the great work that Somerville is doing to build resilience. Y'all have an amazing history of tree protection, of implementing policies like your compensatory storage requirement, impervious surface caps, all of these things to build resilience to flooding, your ongoing projects. Yeah, there's so many wonderful things that Somerville has pursued and is currently pursuing to build resilience that we wanted to celebrate.
If it's not on the slide, it does not mean it's not related to resilience either. We cannot fit everything on the slide. But I've been working with some staff members just to provide a little bit of support, whether that was connections to great folks like Catherine, or whether that was help with grant writing. It's been wonderful to see what projects you all are considering, whether it's the Main Street Resiliency Project or the public safety infrastructure project that you all pursued as well. So just kudos to y'all before we get into this. And the first thing that we like to talk about with jurisdictions is standalone resilience planning. We know that there are resilience elements in comprehensive plans now, but we still want to highlight this as something to consider if it makes sense for your jurisdiction. Standalone resilience planning can ensure that resilience actions are taking place strategically at your jurisdiction and also occurring holistically, not just in one department, but actually throughout departments. So it's something to consider. Common elements of a resilience plan include, taking time to assess current and future risk and vulnerabilities. So not just what is that flooding like today, but as our First Street Foundation data showed, what does it look like in the future? And then backing it up with actions and strategies that we can take to lessen those identified vulnerabilities and risks, whether those are living in the planning world, in the planning department, or whether there are policies that you all want to consider that you have not yet adopted. It could be engineering and infrastructure projects, or it could be citizens awareness, ensuring that they know how to be best prepared at home and in their neighborhoods. So something to consider. And I wanted to highlight a couple recent resilience plans that were adopted, just in case you're curious what they look like and what they're containing. And I've highlighted here Beaufort County's long-term resilience strategy, which looks at current and future flood risk for the county and identifies strategies, a variety of strategies for them to consider. The town of Hilton Head is currently using a SWOT analysis to do their resilience plan, and that should be published later this year. Horry County has had a countywide flood resilience master plan since 2022. And then lastly, I highlighted Charleston County's all hazards vulnerability assessment. So just a couple to consider if you want to take a peek and see what it looks like.
Another way we can consider building resilience to flooding is through gray infrastructure projects, which many of you are familiar with. We think about moving large quantities of stormwater away from these flood-prone areas. So I just wanted to highlight two examples of what SCORE has done in this general region. The first being the installation of the Erdhart Tunnel in the Charleston Medical District. You can see the comparison of just a normal rain event in April of 2024 compared to during Tropical Storm Debbie after the stormwater tunnel was installed. And just the critical impact that this had on moving that standing water away from the Charleston Medical District. And we recognize MUSC as, a statewide asset. So that was really important to our office in getting that stormwater away. Another example is in Mingo Pond along Highway 17 in Georgetown County, installing and upsizing drainage pipes and inlets to clear that standing water away from a critical evacuation route. For Pawleys Island. So those are just two small examples. I'm sure there are many examples, in this area as well. But one central recommendation of the resilience plan that I wanted to highlight related to infrastructure is the recommendation that as we are designing and building critical infrastructure, we need to consider future conditions so that the infrastructure will be, functional and resilient for its entire anticipated lifespan. So if we're thinking, a road or a bridge is going to last for 50 or 75 or 100 years, how can we consider what hazards they're able to withstand and, what they're likely to encounter at the very end of their designed life? So we could be thinking about rainfall, we could be thinking about flood risk, but also, people and population growth and maybe the increased weight associated with electric vehicles. But just having that anticipatory lens and that future focus again of, what is the future going to require and how can we prepare for it? So SCORE is working on future-facing rainfall data through some NOAA Atlas 14 and 15 data to help jurisdictions better be able to consider future conditions when they're planning for infrastructure projects. So one set of that data will be released at the end of this year, and the other is a few years away. But we'll keep you updated and keep the staff updated as well when these data products come available. Another way we can build resilience is through green infrastructure projects, which I know Somerville has a great history of doing and a great interest in green infrastructure projects. But just in case, we want a refresher, green infrastructure really helps to mitigate flood risk by slowing down water and letting water infiltrate the ground and, not having more impervious surface in the area. So it's slowed down and doesn't run off as quickly to a flood prone area. So we could think about having pervious pavement, like parking spots, bioswales, rain gardens, which I know you have in the town as well. And one of the reasons that we really like green infrastructure is because it has many co-benefits associated with it. So there are often really significant water quality benefits related to things like bioswales and rain gardens. There can be some, like microhabitat for our pollinator species and others. A lot of people think that rain gardens add an aesthetic quality for a community. So lots of co-benefits to consider. And 2 case studies of kind of marrying the green infrastructure and the gray infrastructure together. One being Raleigh, North Carolina. As they were undertaking just a normal road widening project, they added native plants to the median. They added some bioretention cells along the roadway. And then they also added bike lanes and sidewalks and public art and energy efficient light fixtures, all these other amenities to make this, more bike ped friendly and also to improve stormwater management and water quality. So this is just an example of kind of trying to add those co-benefits where we can and maximizing, water quantity and quality benefits of gray and green infrastructure. And then a little bit closer to home, Folly Beach's ongoing Center Street Stormwater Improvement Project. Again, it kind of maximizes both gray and green infrastructure benefits by, of course, increasing their pipe sizes and adding inlets, but also adding bioretention cells, pervious parking spaces, and mature trees to, help with the project.
And quickly, I'm just going to breeze through this because I know this is an entity that staff is very familiar with and connected to. But our friends at the Nature Conservancy have developed South Carolina specific materials to help you all consider how to implement nature-based solutions and what is appropriate for your jurisdiction. So on the left here, I have the Nature-Based Exchange Compendium. This is going to be more detailed guidelines specifically for designing and installing nature-based solutions. It does include funding sources too. And then on the right is a living document, which highlights case studies of nature-based solutions across South Carolina. So it's a great way to see what's been implemented already, what's worked, how they funded it, and who actually implemented it too. So these are just 2 great resources to consider if you're interested in learning more about nature-based solutions. And they also have a bunch of wonderful trainings and stuff. And I know Jesse's well connected with them. So if you're curious, ask either her or I.
Thanks, Adelaide. Another strategy we could consider to build resilience is actually through land conservation and restoration, because we see that oftentimes, our wetlands and other areas are best equipped to absorb, store, and convey floodwaters. So at SCORE, we really prioritize land conservation, and we've tried to pursue this pretty aggressively in the past few years. And we prioritize lands to conserve based off this map that I have pulled up here, the flood mitigation through conservation map. And that prioritizes lands based off where floodwaters are expected. So, development's not coming into these risky areas. And then also where land cover and soils can best absorb those floodwaters. So, it provides a benefit for surrounding areas. And a lot of work has been done in this region too, not just at the state level. Of course, we have the Greenbelt programs in the Tri-County area that are very effective in conserving lands. And we've seen examples also of people, restoring lands to enhance their ecosystem services, enhance that sponge function, and allow them to let water infiltrate the ground even better.
And I did want to mention that Dorchester County has a Greenbelt planner, Carolina Gomez Bayo. I don't know if you all have connected with her yet, or if I know staff has, but I just wanted to highlight that Dorchester County does have a point person and a staff contact. So if you all have any specific Greenbelt questions, she's a great go-to.
Kind of in the same vein, when we think about, the benefits of nature and natural systems, we've seen communities have a lot of success in just planning with natural systems. And I know that's pretty vague, so I'll give you an example of a stormwater park. If you're familiar with Unity Park in Greenville, South Carolina, that was the site of their public works facility. It was located in the 100-year floodplain. So of course that had, disruptions in service and loss of assets associated with flood events in that area. So about 5 to 7 years ago now, they decided to relocate that facility to safer, higher ground, and then do some remediation and turn that parcel into a beautiful landmark park for the city of Greenville. So now they have an amphitheater, they have playgrounds, they have bathrooms, but everything is either flood proof or is capable of withstanding flooding, so that on a rainy day, it's able to function as nature intended, as a 100-year floodplain, and store and convey those floodwaters. And then when the floodwaters recede, it's a wonderful, community amenity that has not suffered any damage, and people can continue to recreate and use it as they will. So I think this is a great example of sort of understanding how we can work with the land uses as they currently are and create a great amenity.
I just wanted to add quickly that Catherine and I actually got the chance to visit this park together earlier this year. And we saw it first on a rainy day and the day after on a sunny day. And it was already absolutely dry and the community was out using it. So it's a really, really wonderful example of planning with natural systems.
Another strategy to consider is voluntary housing buyouts, which I know this has happened in the region. But for those of you who aren't familiar, this is where an entity, whether that's the city or a county or a town or the state, they identify flood-prone homes and parcels. Typically, these are repetitive loss properties that have experienced pretty significant damage from multiple floods. And they acquire that home at fair market value prior to the flood event in their home. So after that person is bought out, they're able to relocate to a safer area outside the floodplain. And then the entity that acquired the home comes in and removes all structures, demolishes the parcel, and returns that land to green space for perpetuity through deed restrictions. So that property, like if the state does it, we transfer that property to the local government, and they're able to use that as, like a garden, a park, some other kind of passive use, but not able to erect any structures on it. And this program, of course, can be expensive and, at times challenging to implement. But there are some really critical benefits that come from a voluntary housing buyout program. First, it relocates homeowners to a safer area. So we're getting those families out of harm's way, and also reducing the risk to first responders because they don't have to keep, rescuing people from the same property over and over. But secondly, it increases the green space and the pervious surface in that neighborhood. So it gives more space for water to infiltrate the ground, and it therefore, reduces the flooding pressure and the flood risk for the entire neighborhood. And then finally, this is more relevant for like the state or insurance or FEMA, but it eliminates the financial hardship of having to repair that same home over and over and over. And it's often, honestly, a cost-effective solution. So just something to consider.
And if this is something that resonates with you all, I did want to note that there is commonly state funding available for projects like this following a presidentially declared disaster. I've put up here Tyler Spires as the state hazard mitigation officer. He's a wonderful person to talk to in general, and he's also incredibly knowledgeable about this program. So whether you want to keep this in your back pocket or you want to get in touch with him about how to be prepared for when the next time funding does come available, just know that this is your go-to person, a great contact. I'm happy to put you in touch with him directly.
Thank you. And then finally, the last two are kind of about regulatory processes. We really see that limiting or prohibiting development in flood-prone areas is one of the most effective ways to reduce community risk and damage from flooding, which of course makes sense. So in general, we're not zoning experts here. We know we have experts in the room, but we're just considering directing high-density development away from riskier areas. So there are several examples of how to do this. Again, we're not experts, but just kind of putting that general idea out there of taking flood risk into consideration when zoning decisions and other development decisions are considered. And then at kind of a smaller scale, thinking about the actual home or the parcel itself, it is important to minimize flood-related damages by managing the development that happens in flood-prone areas. So a lot of jurisdictions have approached this by, creating stronger floodplain development ordinances than those that are strictly required by the NFIP. So we've seen that, Greenville County actually requires 4 feet of freeboard. Other folks in the area, like I think Myrtle Beach requires 3 feet, Folly Beach requires 4 feet. There's different levels for different jurisdictions. So something to consider. Other folks actually out in Texas, they take that kind of anticipatory, that future lens when they think about BFE. So they require builders to either elevate to 2 feet above current BFE or 1 foot above projected BFE, whichever is higher. So that's kind of another interesting way of thinking about, what is the future going to look like and how can we consider that in our ordinance? And then as we already talked about, when we talked about the First Street Foundation data, we know that FEMA flood maps are not perfect depictions of flood risk. So some jurisdictions kind of address that by saying that all properties within a certain buffer of the 100-year floodplain are treated as if they are within the 100-year floodplain. So again, not any recommendations here, but just, a lot to think about and a lot to consider what other jurisdictions have done to think about this problem.
And if you want even more ideas and inspiration, I wanted to highlight that the North Carolina Office of Resilience created this tool. It's called the North Carolina Resilience Exchange, and it highlights a bunch of different actions that have been implemented in the region and specifically in North Carolina, if you want to look at our fellow Carolinians. So under the Identify Actions tab, it's just a great way to consider other possibilities that we did not even raise to you. There are a bunch of different ways to implement resilience building actions. So something to keep in mind. And they also pair them up with, for each specific action that's listed there, there's going to be how they funded it and sometimes even contractor notes on how the project went. So this is a very useful tool to keep in your back pocket. Okay, we've thrown a lot at you, just like we did in the first 5 minutes. So we're going to take a couple minutes now. We'd love for you all to take a minute to think about what resilience actions you're interested in seeing in Somerville. This can be, actions that have already taken place and you'd love to see more of them, or something new that maybe you all have not done yet. So we'll give you a minute to think to yourself. If you all want to group up maybe in 3, it looks like, and y'all can do the same thing, and then we'll all share out in a couple minutes. I think I did the 3s pretty well. That worked out. How are we on time? We started like 6:15? Huh? When we started. I think we could just at least 6:30. Okay. I think we should do it, try to finish by
have each group share out briefly what you talked about so we can all hear it. So we love to start with this group if y'all have stuff to share.
Councilwoman, you're gonna be our spokesperson because you took the best notes.
Yeah, lots of good stuff over there. Y'all are talking up a storm. That's wonderful.
She's a great note taker.
Awesome. I'm just capturing this so that we can follow up and yeah, see what resources that we can come up with. Oh. Nice. Wonderful. Thank you all for sharing that. Okay, next group up here.
Well, I personally have a couple ideas of things we should not consider. In Greenville County, for example, it does make sense to have a base flood +4 because their floodwater is confined to a very narrow area. Here in the low country, +4 feet would cover 100 square miles.
Right.
Even going up 1 foot, the water spreads out. So I don't ever want us to consider increasing the base flood +2 because the map's already fairly conservative. The other thing that I don't like is that there are special stormwater rules on the 8 coastal counties, which doesn't make sense because every one of those 8 coastal counties does touch the coast, but they also have upland. So somebody building in St. George, South Carolina, where the elevation is 100+ feet, has to follow the same rules as City of Charleston at elevation 6 feet. I think it's more appropriate to have, if we have coastal zones similar to the wind zones that are related to the proximity to the coast, or even the map that you showed, which I had not seen before, that First Street map.
Mm-hmm.
So the stormwater standards should be based on the actual flooding potential there,
Right.
not just the fact that you're in one of the 8 coastal counties. So one thing we do here in Somerville too is we only allow a house in GR2, for example, that's sitting on an acre or more to build out 30% impervious area, which I don't think is enough. At the same time, somebody who creates a building in downtown Somerville can go 80+% impervious area, which is too much. I think we should reduce that. And you're hitting on a topic that I've been thinking about for a long time as I go through this UDO. So at the same time, though, if we say they can't do 80% impervious, only 60% impervious to save more trees and more green space, we have to give them the ability to go vertical. It's got the same impervious footprint, but they do have the ability to save additional trees. And maybe it's a sliding scale where if you do this much impervious area, you can go this high above the current standard so that they're getting the same net square footage in there. But to me, 100% in downtown Somerville is too much impervious area.
There's one specific case study that I'm going to make sure that we include in our follow-up email that might resonate with you, that gives developers a lot of flexibility on how they consider resilience in their individual development properties. And it's kind of like a menu that you can pick from, allows, well, maybe we'll have a little bit more pervious or less pervious surface, but we're going to do these other alternative actions. So, but it shows even.
Well, I love the cookbook approach to that because I'll give you another example. In our first stormwater manual that we had in Somerville years ago, it was like 12 pages long. Now just the stormwater portions, what is it, like 225 pages long? We tell them exactly how to build it to where a trained monkey with a computer could design anything just by following, if you can possibly follow 225 pages of stormwater manual. So we need to give our professionals more flexibility in how to design these things. And so I like to hold down menu.
Yeah, we'll send that along in the follow-up email. And thank you for sharing your perspective. I love that. Yeah, local context and the local risks and vulnerabilities and landscape, physical geography, all of that. So thank you for pointing that out. Did y'all have anything else you wanted to share from this group?
How long you got now?
No, we covered it pretty well.
That's quite enough.
All right, thank y'all. What about over here?
They spoke for us.
All right, I like that. We'll go straight to resource. Wonderful. Well, we don't want you all to share all these great ideas, but then not feel, equipped walking out the door. So we know you have, great resources in the room with us and great knowledge, but we wanted to share some specific ones. So just to recap what I talked about, resources from SCORE, you have support from me, the local watershed coordinator. If you want to be connected with any resources, please let me know and I'll try my best to connect you with other state agencies, other, for-profit, nonprofit resources, whatever is out there that I know about. You can always reference our statewide plan, which I will include the link to that in our follow-up email. I think we have shared the First Street Foundation data, but if not, we will make sure that your GIS team is connected with that. And we will send out the link to the Resilience Atlas. And again, I'm happy to provide a tutorial on anyone who wants to, get into using that. And then we'll share, other resources associated with SCORE. Really quickly.
Okay, and then some of the external resources we highlighted tonight, we're going to be sharing some additional ones based on what we heard you all were interested in as well. But I just wanted to quickly remind you all, we have the nature-based exchange developed from the Nature Conservancy. That's great if you're interested in some of those specific nature-based solutions. Tyler Spires in the South Carolina Emergency Management Division. Again, we do have a state hazard mitigation officer for our state, and he's a wonderful resource to keep in mind. And then lastly, that North Carolina Resilience Exchange. Also quickly wanted to highlight that I do work as a part of a program that supports local governments in South Carolina. I'm currently partnered with 10 local governments, including some of the folks at Somerville, just helping out where I can. I am a dedicated support person and I am privately funded by the Walmart Foundation. So it takes no dollars on Somerville to access any of my time and the support that I can provide or the program can provide. This network was launched in 2023. It's run by the GEOS Institute, and we're currently in 4 states in the Southeast. So that's, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And again, it provides a dedicated support person in each state. And then we have a network of no-cost technical assistance providers that are first come, first serve, and we offer those in January. So I'll be working with staff early in November, December to start seeing if any of those current needs match what our technical assistance providers can offer you all. And then I wanted to just quickly, I covered this pretty broadly, but, my goal is really to serve as a trusted partner to you all to identify what your current resilience goals and to help you on that. I like to tell the communities I work with, I am not showing up with the to-do list. My goal is to figure out what's on your to-do list and to help you access resources to help move that work forward. And it's very tailored. So based on what you all need as a jurisdiction, and could look like a lot of things, whether that's, help identifying the right grant and actually applying to it or identifying technical assistance opportunities. So just keep in mind that the staff know where to find me and I'm here to help as much as I can. Okay.
So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate your time, especially in the evening. So thank you for your attention, and we're happy to take any questions, and we're always here as a resource with our email as well. So thank you all.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, ladies. All right, council members, one more item on the agenda.
Move adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you all so much.